My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I've been involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry to state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Please allow me to welcome you to the political Rorschach test that is now the United States. By that I mean that everybody, particularly the American left, now looks at an event and sees in that event only what they want to see, not what is actually there. That is what enables the left to look at, say, a military strike to take out a terrorist who has killed scores of Americans and decide that just because Donald Trump did it, it must be a bad thing. It allows Adam Schiff to conduct an impeachment hearing in which he pronounces dubious allegations supported only by hearsay as, and I quote, indisputable facts. And perhaps most relevant to gun rights, it lets billionaire megalomaniac and anti-gun zealot, who is also running for president, by the way, Michael Bloomberg, to look at an event where an armed citizen in a Texas church saved 200 people by shooting an active shooter and proclaim with a straight face that only cops should have guns. More on that later. Today we will also discuss a minor revolution, make that a major revolution, sweeping Virginia and other states in the face of impending gun control. Namely the sanctuary county movement, and it's happening not only in Virginia but right here in North Carolina. We will discuss that and other developments in Virginia, developments that could easily happen here if we lose the 2020 elections, and how you can help Virginia repel gun control. But first, this just in gun rights news. No voter ID for you, you racist. But that's not gun rights news, you say. Well, listen carefully, folks, because what I am about to discuss is more important to your gun rights than any single piece of legislation. Why? Because whoever controls the political system in a state, or in the country for that matter, gets to write the laws. I say this because, as we will discuss later, I can continue to see messages on GRNC's Facebook page blaming Virginia conservatives for, and I quote, letting the state go left. It isn't a matter of conservatives allowing anything, but rather the leftists doing what some shrewd maneuvering that is already going on right here in North Carolina. As you may recall, leftists have been suing to overturn virtually all of the significant gains made by North Carolina conservatives over the past few years. Repeated lawsuits by Eric Holder's National Democratic Redistricting Committee and others, typically the NAACP, have induced leftist judges, typically appointed by Barack Obama, to overturn legislative districts for the General Assembly and then for Congress, creating the distinct possibility that Democrats will take over one or more chambers of our state legislature in the 2020 elections. And they will almost certainly gain 2 Democrat seats in Congress. A near shoo-in for one of those districts is former North Carolina House Representative Deborah Ross, who formerly ran the state office for the ACLU before serving in the North Carolina House, and who has never met a gun she wouldn't ban. Bear in mind that the left-wing governor, our left-wing Democrat Governor Roy Cooper, and the left-wing Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein are already in place, meaning takeover of the General Assembly by Democrats will place us in exactly the same place Virginia is now. In the latest and most brazen attempt to subvert the will of voters, the NAACP has attacked the latest iteration of our voter ID law, specifically the version approved by voters as a ballot initiative in 2018. In late December, federal judge and Obama appointee Loretta Briggs issued an injunction on the voter ID law, for which you have probably already gotten a notification from the state. You see, the voter ID law, according to Biggs, has, and I quote, discriminatory intent. In her decision, Biggs wrote, quote, North Carolina has a sordid history of racial discrimination and voter suppression stretching back to the time of slavery through the era of Jim Crow and, crucially, continuing up to the present day. Adding, and I quote, racial discrimination and racial polarization have historically pervaded North Carolina's political climate and still do. End quote. But it's impossible to ignore, she said, the state's history of politicians violating the rights of minorities for political gain, since, and I quote, race and party are inexorably linked in North Carolina. In the 2016 elections, Biggs wrote, only 10% of black voters in North Carolina supported Republicans, whereas 2/3 of white voters supported Republicans. Translated, that means any district drawn to favor Republicans must, by definition, be racist. No word from Biggs on whether black voters who overwhelmingly supported Barack Obama were equally racist. Pending a final decision, this means the voter ID law will not be in effect for the March 3rd primary elections. Whether or not it will be in effect for the November general election will depend on the final outcome from the Court of Appeals. All this, by the way, is in addition to another lawsuit claiming that due to political districts being overturned, that everything done by the General Assembly in recent years is, and I quote, illegitimate. That lawsuit has not yet been heard. In other news, there is a heads up from gun writer Dave Workman, writing in the excellent firearms news service AmmoLand.com. The piece is entitled, Every Town's Red Flag Warning, H.R. 8 was just the beginning, and reports, and I quote, a new email blast from anti-gun billionaire Michael Bloomberg's Everytown for Gun Safety, intercepted by AmmoLand, makes it clear the gun prohibition lobbying group wants to see the U.S. House pass a new national red flag law, declaring, and I quote, we need our U.S. representatives to keep gun violence prevention as a legislative priority. Anti-gunners believe they have the momentum, declaring last year's passage of H.R. 8 was, quote, just the beginning. H.R. 8 is the federal legislation passed by the House 240 to 190, along partisan lines, last February 27th, requiring so-called universal background checks for all firearms transactions. By the way, that has not passed the Republican-led Senate. A copy of the message, appearing over the name of Federal Legislative Campaigns Director Sarah Trumbull, was obtained Tuesday by AmmoLand. Bloomberg is now running for president. And I quote, this is a major victory for the gun violence prevention movement, the Everytown message stated. It was the first time either chamber of Congress passed significant gun safety legislation in over 20 years, and they didn't stop there. The House went on to pass multiple life-saving gun violence prevention bills in 2019, but, and here's the critical phrase, there is still more critical work to be done. The House has the opportunity to pass even more gun safety legislation this year, including bills like H.R. 1236, the Extreme Risk Protection Order of 2019, a bill that empowers law enforcement and family members to intervene at moments of crisis to prevent gun violence before it happens. But that will only occur if your U.S. reps continue to prioritize gun violence prevention as a top priority. Yeehaw. Right now, we're going to take a short break. After that break, we will return with what the Texas church shooting, in which an armed citizen saved nearly 200 people, means to you and to the gun rights movement in general, and also the latest just in from what is rapidly becoming the People's Republic of Virginia, and how that may impact you, and moreover, what you can do to help. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After a break, we will return with still more critical information, better enabling you to defend your gun rights. Join us in just a moment, please. My name is Paul Balone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. In our last segment, we discussed how the left is using lawsuits against political districts drawn by Republicans to overturn Republican control. Many gun rights supporters seem reluctant to accept that political redistricting has anything to do with gun rights. Fortunately, every now and again, the left says what they really mean and what they really want. Such is the case right here in North Carolina, when a left-wing think tank, and yes, I know, left-wing think tank is an oxymoron, calling itself North Carolina Policy Watch, recently had a rare moment of truth-telling when it said, and I quote, "Most North Carolinians favor stricter gun laws." Garbage, according to a recent polling, but efforts to advance gun safety legislation have languished in the state General Assembly. That disconnect is largely due to, in part, to partisan gerrymandering, according to a report issued Tuesday by the Center for American Progress, a Washington, D.C. based think tank that advocates for progressive, meaning left-wing, policies. The analysis looks at gerrymandering in 5 states, including North Carolina, where Democrats won the majority of statewide votes, but Republicans maintained control over the state legislatures. Conservative politicians in those states have, quote, refused to allow a meaningful debate on any common-sense gun measures, according to the report's authors. Translated, the left now wants control of the political redistricting process in order to ban guns. Get ready for a wave of anti-gun propaganda disguised as research. For years, you've heard anti-gun organizations whine that the Centers for Disease Control was prohibited by Congress from doing what they call gun safety research. That is a lie, of course. Congress did nothing of the sort. What Congress did do back in 1996 was to pass the Dickey Amendment, which said, and I quote, "None of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control." As part of the Dickey Amendment, Congress defunded the CDC for the $2.6 million previously allocated for gun research, aka propaganda. The reason was that under the incapable direction of one Mark Rosenberg, the CDC was busily cranking out anti-gun propaganda and calling it research. One article written by honest researchers at the time referred to what Rosenberg and his cohorts were doing thusly, and I quote, "The health advocacy literature against firearms is a sagecraft literature in which academic sages prostitute scholarship, systematically inventing, misinterpreting, selecting, or otherwise manipulating data to validate preordained conclusions." That piece was called Guns and Public Health, Epidemic of Violence or Pandemic of Propaganda. Well, to phrase a bad movie, they're back. In December, Congress did what Congress does best when it once again screwed the American people by reinserting funds for CDC gun research, and I put that in quotes, into the $1.4 trillion federal budget, a deal discovered only at the last minute by gun owners of America. The anti-gun propagandists are celebrating, of course, said Rosenberg, who fortunately no longer heads the CDC project. This is a deal of historic proportions. One hopes he is not right. 2 weeks ago, on Sunday, December 29th, at the West Freeway Church of Christ in Texas, an armed parishioner saved nearly 200 people when an active shooter shot two parishioners and set about trying to kill the rest. Another parishioner, Jack Wilson, had volunteered to direct church security. Unlike some other recent mass killings, this church was ready. Wilson, a former sheriff's deputy and defensive firearms instructor who trained others in the congregation in church security, like the West Freeway Church, was ready. Jack Wilson was ready. And so when the active shooter, who was already considered suspect due to his disguise and his overcoat, pulled a shotgun and shot two people, Jack Wilson smoothly drew his handgun and, from a distance of about 10 yards, put a single round into the shooter's head. I say very smoothly drew his handgun because it was all captured on church security video. Video which, sadly for the media, could not be denied or downplayed. Increasingly, not only Texans, but citizens everywhere are finally arming themselves against violent sociopaths bent on mass murder. 2 years ago, for example, NRA member and gun rights supporter Stephen Williford used an AR-15 to stop an active shooter at a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. In fact, religious institutions in particular are training and arming volunteers to stop mass killers. Most instructive in the tragedy were two things. First, the value of not just carrying a firearm for self-protection, but in training to do so. In an earlier edition of the show, I interviewed Kevin Dylas of Blue Ridge Marksmanship in Burnsville, North Carolina. My family and I have taken numerous defensive firearms courses at Blue Ridge, and having been to some of the best defensive firearms schools in the world, up to and including Thunder Ranch, I can assure you that Blue Ridge Marksmanship ranks among the best. Now, you can find Kevin's courses at blueridgemarksmanship.com, by the way, and Kevin advises that several church groups have asked him for security training, which he does indeed provide to religious institutions. Again, that's blueridgemarksmanship.com. What Kevin emphasized was the value of training in combating active shooter scenarios. Now, equally instructive in the recent church shooting was the response of gun control advocates. Predictably, the media sought to downplay Wilson's heroism. Earlier accounts depicted only that 3 had died from the active shooter, which, as they often do, counted the killer as one of the so-called victims. Others falsely attributed the save to an FBI agent, because after all, it's just cops who save lives, right, with guns, right? And of course, gun control activists were shocked that at least half a dozen parishioners at the church carried guns. Allow me to quote CNBC. And I quote, "Gun safety advocates," they're always gun safety advocates, aren't they? "Gun safety advocates argued that the shooting itself wouldn't have happened if the U.S. and Texas had stronger gun regulation. Or consider the tweet from Shannon Watts, founder of gun safety group Moms Demand Action. And I quote, "Media referencing the white settlement shooting owe the public a nuanced discussion. We need watchdog to make sure it's so." I don't know about you, but I interpret that to mean she wants watchdogs to censor the media and deliver a nuanced report that slants the facts the way she wants them. So much for freedom of the press in Shannon Watts' perfect world. But the most instructive response came from billionaire gun ban advocate and would-be President Michael Bloomberg himself, as reported by our friends at ncrenegade.com and elsewhere. This is what Michael Bloomberg had to say. Quote, "It may be true, I wasn't there and I don't know the facts, that somebody in the congregation had their own gun and killed the person who hurt 2 other people. But it's the job of law enforcement to have guns and decide when to shoot. You just do not want the average citizen carrying a gun in a crowded place." I know what you're thinking. What a moron. There weren't any cops in the church, and waiting for them would cost lives. Or maybe you're thinking, so says the guy surrounded by a phalanx of armed guards. Or almost certainly you're thinking, the average citizen, this elitist SOB, thinks that we, the unwashed average citizen, can't be trusted to protect ourselves. But these points, while true, miss the bigger issue. It isn't that gun ban advocates are unaware that armed citizens routinely save lives, or that gun-free zones attract violent sociopaths. The grotesque reality is they don't care. That is why your entreaties to anti-gun advocates invariably fall on deaf ears. A few years back, I had an idiot send me a message via GRNC's website claiming that armed citizens never really used guns to save lives and that was a red herring fronted by gun rights advocates. So I sent him news links for about a dozen accounts of citizens using firearms to defend themselves. I sent him ironclad proof. What do you suppose I got back from him? Nothing. Not a word. Why? Because he didn't care. The reason gun ban advocates don't care is that arming citizens saves lives is that gun control makes you reliant on government. It gives your masters more control over you because you must grovel to them for your safety. And the issue is indeed about control. Now, take this to its logical conclusion. If they know arming citizens could save lives, but they work against it anyway in the interest of increased control over citizens, that means your death and the death of your loved ones are acceptable to them. They are acceptable deaths in the interest of exerting more control over you. Now, I know what you're saying. You're claiming my aunt, who favors gun control, wants me dead? Of course not. As I always say, the liberals divide into two camps, useful idiots and the manipulators of useful idiots. Your aunt, who has been fed information by the mainstream media, might actually think gun control saves lives. But rest assured, Chuck Schumer knows otherwise. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with still more critical information better enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. You have no doubt heard the battle of our lives is going on right now in Virginia and threatening to spread to our own state. In November, Democrats seized control of both chambers of the Virginia legislature, giving them complete control of the state. The ones who engineered the rout of conservatives were essentially Michael Bloomberg, Barack Obama, and former Attorney General Eric Holder. And now Democrat Governor Ralph Blackface Northam is planning a host of gun bans, which, legislatively speaking, cannot be stopped. Sue till they're blue, that is the strategy being employed by none other than Eric Holder of Fast and Furious infamy, first in Virginia and now right here in North Carolina. Holder and his National Redistricting Action Fund are suing over political districts, claiming they were unfairly drawn to favor one party. In actuality, the practice of the party in power drawing political districts to favor itself dates back to the dawn of our republic, and the Supreme Court has repeatedly refused to stop the practice. As I said, you as a gun rights owner should care because whoever gets to draw the districts gets power for the next 10 years. And of course, Holder and company are only suing in states controlled by Republicans. To them, gerrymandering in Democrat-controlled states is perfectly acceptable. The result has been a perfect storm in Virginia, where Holder changed the districts to favor Democrats, Bloomberg injected out-of-state money to control millions in local races, and the NRA has been largely absent because it was consumed with internal power struggles. Let's take a look at what Democrats are proposing in Virginia now that they have returned to session. Northam and company have proposed the usual laundry list, of course: semi-auto and magazine bans which, by the way, were far more draconian than the 1994 so-called assault weapon ban, which expired in 2004, and which originally lacked any sort of grandfather clause for guns already owned. By the way, as originally drafted, the semi-auto ban would have banned every pistol even capable of accepting magazines holding more than 10 rounds, meaning it banned most commonly owned handguns. And so as originally proposed, you would have awakened one day to be a criminal. Later, the Democrats, faced with a groundswell of opposition, backed off on banning guns already owned, instead saying that you could continue to own them provided you register them, since, after all, registration is the necessary prelude to confiscation. And, of course, red flag gun confiscation laws, so-called universal background checks, one gun a month rationing, and more. But the anti-gun gunners in Virginia also found new things to ban. Says the Media Research Center, and I quote, Dan Helmer, a Democratic delegate-elect who just unseated a 17-year Republican incumbent for Virginia's 40th district, said he plans to put forward legislation that would outlaw indoor gun ranges with more than 50 employees to reduce workplace shootings. How that works, I'm really not sure. But anyways, make it illegal for Virginians to open carry firearms in their cars and restrict reciprocity agreements, that means you, for concealed carry permits from other states that don't meet what he calls Virginia's standards. Better still, HB 567, bans all gun ranges with 50 or more employees unless they are in government-owned buildings, neatly giving the government control over whether or not you can shoot. But there's more. HB 318, introduced by Democratic delegate Kay Corey, would create, quote, ammunition-free zones where even having a bullet in your car would make you a criminal. I guess the carnage created by supposedly gun-free zones isn't enough for them. Or, under HB 961, being sponsored by Democrat Mark Levine, Breitbart News reports, and I quote, Virginians who have undergone the legal process to acquire a suppressor would be labeled felons after the passage of a 6-month grace period in which suppressors could be transferred to persons out of state who are allowed to own them, destroyed or rendered inoperable, or surrendered to a, quote, state or local law enforcement agency. And days ago, newly elected lawmakers in the Commonwealth of Virginia voted to ban firearms being carried by the public in state capitol buildings, but not, of course, for their own armed bodyguards. And incidentally, the Democrats who control Virginia want citizens to pay for gun confiscation and have allocated $250,000 for it in the proposed state budget bill, HB 30. According to Phil Van Cleve, the president of Virginia Citizens Defense League, and I quote, it's like they have taken the Constitution and dropped it into a shredder. VCDL has correctly refused to accept the compromise, and I put that word in quotes, of allowing gun owners to keep banned guns provided they register them, because Van Cleve correctly understands that compromise, as the gun ban movement defines it, is a process under which you might lose less than under their original proposal, but you still lose. In response to the proposals, Virginia gun owners are in near revolt. Drawing on a tactic of the left in which cities proclaim themselves sanctuaries for illegal aliens, more than 126 Virginia cities and counties have passed resolutions declaring support for the Second Amendment and vowing to resist gun control. That's right, 126 cities and counties. According to Van Cleve, even Governor Northam's own home county passed a sanctuary resolution. In late December, Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring, that would be the same Attorney General who a few years ago tried to end concealed handgun reciprocity for Virginia, issued an official opinion that the Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions being passed by Virginia localities have, quote, no legal effect. Then, addressing his Board of Supervisors, which had just passed a sanctuary resolution, Culpeper County Sheriff Scott Jenkins made a vow to deputize thousands of citizens to defend their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. In response, some Democrats have threatened not only to withhold funds from sanctuary cities, but even to call out the National Guard. In response to that, one county, Tazewell County to be exact, passed not only a Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance, but also created a militia. Things are getting ugly in Virginia. The media, of course, have piled on against gun rights. In a Washington Post editorial claiming, yes, Virginia, you have a gun problem, the Post goes on to cite all sorts of awful things supposedly resulting from gun ownership, then claimed that the election results in November were some sort of referendum on gun control, instead of the actuality that liberal Democrat lawsuits in liberal courts, managed to redraw districts combined with millions of dollars in Bloomberg money injected into state races. Said the Post, quote, Voters in Virginia who are tired of the relentless gun violence, 60% of which is suicide, elected a fleet of new legislators who campaigned on long overdue changes to Virginia's gun laws. According to the Post, this is not an attack on gun rights, mind you, and I quote, "But this is where the gun enthusiasts' fantasies begin. The gun guys are scared out of their minds that someone's going to come and take their guns." Again, fantasy. None of that gun confiscation stuff is real. It's all just a figment of your imagination. They go on to say, they live in a make-believe world where there are heroes and patriots under attack. They believe the fantasy that there are good guys with guns who will stop bad guys with guns. Never mind that the fantasy happens on a regular basis, as we just demonstrated. The left never lets facts get in the way of a good political argument. One thing that should interest gun rights supporters, even from other states, is that on January 20th, Virginia Citizens Defense League, or VCDL, is holding a lobby day at the state legislature in Richmond. Now, VCDL actually holds a lobby day at the opening of each legislative session. But this one promises to be special, with buses coming in from all over Virginia and even a variety of other states, and by some estimates, as many as 120,000 gun rights supporters might turn out on January 20th. According to Van Cleve, Virginia residents plan on going into the legislature to lobby lawmakers at 8 a.m. And at 11 a.m., there will be a massive rally for the Second Amendment right on the Capitol steps. The rally has quite a list of speakers, including Stephen Williford, whom I mentioned earlier, and who defended a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, against an active shooter by engaging the shooter with an AR-15. It's important to realize that one way or another, Virginia is a bellwether. If Virginians stop gun control, even in a state now controlled exclusively by anti-gun Democrats, they will have proven that grassroots mobilization by Second Amendment supporters can successfully stop maneuvering by the left, despite gerrymandering and injection of out-of-state money. On the other hand, if anti-gun forces succeed in Virginia, you can count on them showing up at your doorstep very soon indeed. Consequently, I urge you to attend the VCDL rally in Richmond on January 20th. You can get information at vcdl.org. Again, that's vcdl.org. By the way, as always, we suggest you dress for the press by avoiding camo or shirts and slogans shirts and signs with inflammatory slogans, all of which give the anti-gun media ammunition to depict you as an extremist. Again, that's vcdl.org. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. After a short break, we will return with still more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. In our last segment, we discussed the gun owner revolt taking place against a host of gun ban proposals being made by Democrats who took over the state of Virginia due to lawsuits filed to draw political districts favorable to Democrats and due to the injection of out-of-state millions by anti-gun zealot Michael Bloomberg. Again, I strongly recommend you attend the gun rights rally in Richmond on January 20th, which is being organized by Virginia Citizens Defense League. Again, January 20th, and for information, go to vcdl.org. That's VCDL, like Virginia Citizens Defense League, vcdl.org. As I have said, all of the elements of the perfect storm that swept Virginia in their 2019 general election are in place right here in North Carolina and could cost us control of the legislature in the 2020 elections. If that happens, you can count on anti-gun Democrats in the legislature to collude with anti-gun Democrat Governor Roy Cooper and anti-gun Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein to do in North Carolina exactly what anti-gun Democrats are doing in Virginia. Now, I'm sure you noticed that I keep using the words anti-gun Democrat. Some of you, particularly of the blue persuasion, are probably saying Vallone is being needlessly partisan. After all, gun rights isn't a partisan issue, it's a constitutional issue. Well, I've had that discussion even in groups of preppers where I've heard the common refrain of the South, I'm a Democrat, my father was a Democrat, and my father's father was a Democrat. And obviously the South is traditionally Democrat, having been subjected to Reconstruction by the Republican Party after the war between the states. In fact, I live in a rural county in western North Carolina, a county in which nearly everybody owns guns. Hell, my doctor owns guns. A county which is undoubtedly overwhelmingly pro-life. A county which probably has little time for the LGBTQ and what other ever alphabet they've lately added that movement. A county of traditional American people with traditional American values. But do you know who was the #1 vote getter in the Democrat primary in 2016? Bernie Sanders. I'm sorry, that would be socialist Bernie Sanders. Do you know which native son my county sends to Raleigh to represent them in the North Carolina House of Representatives? Democrat Joe Sam Queen, the guy who I caught dead to rights at a fundraiser, helping a fundraiser for the state's main gun control organization, North Carolinians Against Gun Violence. Joe Sam Queen, a Democrat who consistently votes against gun rights and for the limousine liberals who want to ban guns. In fact, before I lived in western North Carolina, my organization caught a ration of doo-doo from that part of the state when we opposed Democrat Heath Shuler for re-election to Congress. That would be Congressman Heath Shuler, who brokered a deal for House passage of the Disclose Act, which would have gutted gun rights organizations like my own. Fortunately, the bill failed in the U.S. Senate and never became law. And why did my county choose to be represented by legislators who do not support the values of the people who live in the county? Because those legislators are Democrats. Now, in case you think I'm being partisan for the sake of partisanship, that I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, understand that I am equally reviled in the leadership of both parties. I have blasted Republican President pro tem of the North Carolina Senate, Phil Berger, on more than one occasion. I have blasted the weak-kneed and consequently short-lived Republican Governor Pat McCrory. I have blasted and attempted to defeat the rhino, that would be Republican in name only, who represents us in the U.S. Senate named Tom Tillis. And I routinely recount what a one-time acquaintance, who is now unfortunately deceased, namely Washington Times columnist Samuel Francis, once told me. Namely, quote, our political system is anchored by two dominant parties, the stupid party and the evil party, and occasionally in the spirit of bipartisanship, they produce legislation that is both stupid and evil. I am the guy who's twice put demonstrators at state Republican conventions. Similarly, in past years, I have enjoyed Democrat sponsors for legislation I have written. In the late 1990s, Democrat North Carolina House Representative Pryor Gibson sponsored our bill for concealed handgun reciprocity with other states. Unfortunately, that bill died in the Democrat-controlled legislature, but I will give them credit for at least giving it a committee hearing. In the early 2000s, it was Democrat Senator Scott Thomas, whose bill we eventually got enacted into law, and which gave us a solid concealed handgun reciprocity law, which makes your North Carolina concealed handgun permit valid in 37 states. It was Democrat Doug Berger, not to be confused with Republican Phil Berger, who sponsored the first iteration of our Castle Doctrine bill, a bill which, as eventually passed, not only reinforced the right of citizens to use deadly force against invasions of their home, their motor vehicle, or their workplace, but also created a stand your ground provision under which, if you are any place where you may lawfully be and you face a deadly threat, you are not required to retreat prior to using deadly force in self-defense. Amusingly enough, when we gave Doug Berger GRNC's highest four-star evaluation, I got a call from the campaign of Phil Berger insisting that we must have mixed up their voting records. Eventually, I convinced them that we did in fact mean Doug Berger, who might have been liberal on some issues but was solid on guns. So, why do I now use the words anti-gun Democrat as a single epithet? You remember that old commercial, "This is not your father's Oldsmobile"? Yeah, I know, I'm dating myself since Oldsmobile doesn't even exist anymore. But by the same token, this is not your father's Democrat Party. That Democrat Party had blue dog Democrats that supported traditional American values. Democrats who supported gun rights, like NRA board member and Congressman John Dingell. It was, after all, a North Carolina General Assembly controlled by Democrats, which in 1994 passed our original concealed handgun bill. And by the way, the Democrats acted in a bipartisan fashion to pass that bill, since the main sponsors were Republicans. But that Democrat Party began to disappear at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. That was when the hard left began taking control of the party. Have you ever heard the 60s protest song, "Won't You Please Come to Chicago"? Well, that's what it was all about. The counterculture and anti-gun war protest groups had been promising to come to Chicago and disrupt the convention, and the city promised to maintain law and order. For 8 days, the protesters were met by the Chicago Police Department in the streets and parks of Chicago, while the U.S. Democratic Party met at the convention in the International Amphitheater, with the protests climaxing in what a major report later said was a police riot on the night of August 28, 1968. Such was the beginning of the end of the Democrat Party. Even in 2014, Politico, which is not a left-wing organization, or certainly not a right-wing organization, Politico ran a piece entitled "Blue Crush: How the Left Took Over the Democratic Party." And so we began the seesawing of American politics that we see today. Jimmy Carter, followed by Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton, followed by George W. Bush. Barack Obama, followed by Donald Trump. What you have to understand is that prior to the Reagan Revolution, the left was winning. You think Richard Nixon was a conservative? Not hardly. Republicans were losing not only elections, but their identity. They were becoming, in the words of more than one pundit, Democrat light. So when the Republican Revolution of 1994 took place after passage of the Brady Act and so-called assault weapon ban, when support for gun control cost Al Gore even his home state in the 2000 election, the left decided that it was being denied its proper ascendancy, the control of the country that leftists always assumed they would have. They started to get angry that the economy thrived under Reagan and now Trump. Angry when traditional values began a resurgence under Reagan and solidified to fight the Clinton administration. Angry when the rising right began to fight the class warfare that the left espoused. And this is where we ended up, with disenfranchised socialists taking over the Democratic Party, and a political system that is polarized to the point of being on the brink of civil war, a political system in which opponents can't even agree on how an election should take place, much less who should be elected. But many people hate politics. They hate the games. They hate the maneuvering. They don't keep up with what changed. And so they don't know the Democrat Party began to run away from them in 1968. They don't realize it no longer espouses their values. They think a nice guy, maybe like a Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who harbors traditional values, will support them. But even those guys eventually get drawn to the dark side by party leadership that's beholden to its left-wing base, leadership that will kill the nice guy's bills, deny money to his district, and even primary him or her if he refuses to toe the party line. In sum, you need to tell your friends that still vote Democrat that despite their traditional values, this is not your father's Democratic Party anymore. My name is Paul Vallone. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, HyattGuns.com. See you next Sunday at 5.